Colonel Potter, sir, my last wish is to be buried in my mother's wedding gown.
I've seen these Dodgers for 40 years, all the tricks. Dismissed!
Few shows in television history managed to make people laugh and cry within the same 30 minutes the way MASH did. For 11 seasons, this series about a mobile army surgical hospital during the Korean War became one of the most beloved and most watched programs in American broadcasting. Its finale in 1983 remains one of the most watched single television broadcasts ever produced. But what many casual fans don't realize is that the show they remember was never a fixed, unchanging cast of characters. Behind the operating room jokes and the wisecracks about army bureaucracy, MASH went through a revolving door of talent. Actors who felt like the beating heart of the series walked away, sometimes quietly, sometimes in ways that shocked millions of viewers overnight. Some left because their characters had run out of road creatively. Some left because the show simply couldn't offer them what they needed anymore, whether that was more money, more screen time, or more personal freedom. And some left because the emotional weight of playing a character shaped by war, week after week, year after year, became too heavy to carry. This is the story of the people who built MASH from the ground up and why, one by one, so many of them chose to say goodbye. To understand why the departures hit so hard, it helps to understand what MASH was trying to do in the first place. The origin of the franchise traces back to a novel written by a former Army surgeon who served in Korea. He published his fictionalized account of Army medical life under a pen name, blending dark comedy with the grim reality of a field hospital just miles from the front line. That book found an audience looking for something honest about war, especially with American troops still fighting in Vietnam at the time. A feature film adaptation followed a couple of years later, directed with a loose, improvisational style that felt radical for its time. The film's irreverence toward military authority and its unflinching depiction of battlefield medicine struck a chord with audiences who were watching nightly news footage of a very different, very real war unfold on their television screens. It became a genuine sensation and picked up major awards on the festival circuit. Then came the television series. Two writers took the concept of the film and reshaped it for weekly television, keeping the setting and the gallows humor, but building out a cast of characters who could grow and change over years rather than a single 90-minute runtime. The show premiered in the early 1970s, and contrary to what its later success would suggest, it nearly didn't survive its first season. Ratings were shaky enough that cancellation was a real possibility. A scheduling shift to a different night of the week turned things around. And from there, the show climbed toward the cultural institution it eventually became. What made MASH different from other sitcoms of its era wasn't just the setting. It was willing to let episodes end without resolution, to use the sounds of war instead of a laugh track, and to let its characters carry real psychological scars. That willingness to evolve is exactly what created friction behind the scenes. As the show matured and certain characters were given more depth and more screen time, others found themselves standing still while the story moved on without them. That imbalance, more than any single dramatic blow-up, is what pushed several of the show's original stars toward the exit. One of the show's original stars played the bumbling, well-meaning commanding officer of the unit, a character who represented a kind of exhausted decency in the middle of chaos. He wasn't the sharpest or the wittiest character in the cast, but audiences adored him precisely because he felt so human. He won industry recognition for the role early on, and for a while, it looked like he had found the defining part of his career. But there was a problem, and it wasn't really about the character at all. As the series went on, the show increasingly built its emotional core around the actor playing the lead surgeon, a performer who is also becoming deeply involved in writing and directing the series. That actor's growing creative influence meant his character absorbed more and more of the show's dramatic weight, while other roles, however beloved, started to feel more like supporting fixtures than co-leads. The commanding officer's actor grew restless. He wanted the kind of leading man career he believed he was capable of, not a permanent position as the second or third name in the credits. In interviews around that period, he was fairly candid about wanting to headline his own project rather than perpetually orbit someone else's spotlight. It wasn't vanity so much as ambition. He had genuine confidence that he could carry a show of his own, and he didn't want to spend his career finding out whether that was true from the sidelines of somebody else's hit. So, after 3 seasons, he told the producers he wouldn't be returning. What happened next became one of the most talked about moments in 1970s television. Rather than quietly transferring the character out of the unit, as most sitcoms would have done, the writers chose to kill him off entirely. In the final moments of that season's finale, word arrives that his transport plane went down over open water with no survivors. There was no swelling music, no comedic button to soften the blow, just stunned silence from the remaining cast. It was one of the first times American television had allowed a familiar, comforting sitcom character to die permanently, without warning, and the reaction was immediate. The network was flooded with letters, some praising the honesty of the choice, others furious that a character they loved had been taken from them so abruptly. For the writers, the moment wasn't cruelty for shock value. It was a deliberate reminder that the show was still, underneath the comedy, a story about a war where people did not always make it home. As for the actor himself, his career after leaving didn't go the way he'd hoped. He signed on for a new sitcom built around his own comedic persona, and it was canceled after a single season. A second attempt at headlining his own show fared even worse, becoming something of a punchline in later years rather than the star vehicle he'd envisioned. Looking back on the decision roughly a decade later, he admitted with some regret that leaving had essentially removed him from a game he might never have topped anyway. He continued working steadily in television for years afterward, but he never again found a role that resonated with audiences the way his run on MASH had. When he passed away in the mid-1990s, former castmates remembered him warmly as a generous, good-humored presence both on set and off, and fans still consider his final scene one of the most gut-wrenching moments in sitcom history. If the commanding officer's exit was a loud, headline-grabbing event, the departure of the actor who played the unit's other central surgeon was almost the opposite. One season he was there, sharing scenes and comedic timing with his on-screen best friend, and the next season he had simply vanished with no explanation offered to the audience. His character had originally been conceived as an equal partner in a comedic double act, 2 rebellious surgeons using humor as armor against the horrors around them. Audiences responded strongly to that friendship, and for the show's first few seasons it functioned almost like a two-hander. But as the series leaned further into serialized storytelling and deeper character work, the writing increasingly funneled dramatic material toward his co-star, who by that point was shaping much of the show's creative direction as a writer and director, as well as a performer. The actor didn't seem to resent his co-star personally. By most accounts, they got along well off set. But he grew frustrated watching his character stagnate while everyone around him kept evolving. He later described the shift bluntly, saying his character had gone from being one of 2 central figures to essentially just agreeing with everything the lead said. For a performer who had signed on expecting a true ensemble show, that erosion of purpose was hard to accept. Rather than making a public statement or negotiating an exit storyline, he simply chose not to renew his involvement once his commitment ended, and did so quietly enough that the production reportedly didn't have full confirmation he was gone until shortly before the next season began filming. There's an interesting footnote here, too. His arrangement with the show had apparently never been formalized into an official contract. It had effectively been a handshake agreement from the start, which meant that when the producers considered pursuing legal action over his abrupt departure, there was no binding paperwork to enforce. He hadn't broken a contract because there wasn't really a contract to break. The fallout on screen was awkward. Writers had to scramble to explain his character's absence at the top of the following season, folding it into a brief line of dialogue rather than crafting any kind of send-off. Audiences who had just processed losing one major character were now blindsided by the disappearance of another. It understandably fueled speculation and frustration. A new character was introduced to fill the gap, a steadier, more emotionally grounded surgeon who ultimately gave the show a different flavor entirely, trading fast-paced buddy comedy for a more introspective dynamic. The actor's post-MASH path took an unusual turn. Rather than chasing another long-running television role, He leaned into a genuine passion for finance. Having studied history before his acting career and eventually building a serious second career as an investor and financial commentator, becoming a familiar face on business television discussing markets and economics. He never fully abandoned acting, taking the occasional role or television movie, but investing became where he found his lasting professional identity. Despite the abruptness of his exit, there didn't appear to be any lingering animosity between him and his former castmates. His on-screen best friend spoke fondly of him for years afterward, calling him one of the sharpest people he'd ever worked alongside. When he died in his early 80s and the mid-2010s, tributes from the cast reflected genuine warmth rather than old grudges, a sign that whatever tension existed on set never poisoned the friendships that had formed there. Not every departure from MASH was about ambition or frustration with a shrinking role. One of the show's most beloved characters, the endearingly earnest company clerk with an uncanny sixth sense for incoming helicopters, was played by an actor who had actually originated the role in the original film adaptation before bringing it to television. On screen, the character served almost as the emotional center of the unit, a symbol of innocence surrounded by a war that threatened to swallow it whole. Off-screen, though, the actor playing him was quietly struggling. By the show's later seasons, the demands of a hit television production had begun to wear on him in ways that went beyond simple fatigue. He dealt with real struggles with anxiety, the kind of thing that wasn't widely discussed or destigmatized in the entertainment industry at that time, and the grueling schedule of a top-rated series left him increasingly separated from his family during a period when his daughter was still young. He later admitted that missing those early years with her felt like a mistake he never fully made peace with. A castmate who worked closely with him later reflected that he often felt he wasn't receiving the recognition or appreciation he deserved, even though, in that castmate's view, the rest of the cast respected him deeply. There were also practical disagreements over his contract. He wanted better compensation and more flexibility to reduce his workload so he could spend more time at home. And while the producers made some accommodations, granting him additional time off and trimming his episode count, it ultimately wasn't enough to keep him satisfied. By the show's 8th season, he decided he was done, but unlike the abrupt exits that had come before him, the production gave his character a proper farewell. A 2-part episode built around his character's departure became one of the most quietly devastating installments the series ever produced, ending with a nearly wordless final shot of him walking away into the distance, his signature teddy bear left behind. It remains one of the most emotionally affecting moments in the show's run precisely because it trusted silence to do the work that dialogue usually would have handled. After leaving MASH, he largely stepped back from the spotlight. A short-lived spin-off failed to find an audience, and rather than continuing to chase television success, he redirected much of his energy toward painting, wildlife conservation, and, somewhat unexpectedly, inventing. He eventually held patents related to fishing equipment. He described his departure simply as being about family and burnout, a desire to reclaim pieces of his life that the show's demands have been slowly eating